Hello and welcome to episode 6, part 1 of the Bitchin' Betty podcast. I'm Betty and I will be your host. So if you've been following along, last week I told you we were doing the Somme, which is one of the major battles from World War I, but I lied. We're just going to do a whole World War I mini-series, which is really awesome, I think. So for every 4 weeks, I'm going to hit you with a 2-part episode on World War I. It'll be 2 parts back to back, maybe a day or so in between both episodes, from the buildup of the war to the aftermath. So I'm going to do them in 2 parts because there's a lot of information, and I feel like an hour-long episode is great for hardcore podcast listeners, but 20 to 30 minutes is way easier to digest, and because World War I is such an important event in world history, I really want to make it easy to take in and understand the information so you can walk away feeling like you really know something. And since this is the first episode of the series, I'll be covering the lead up to the Archduke's assassination and the first couple months of the war up until the first battle of the Marne. So, kind of, I guess, a preface about why I'm doing World War I. There's some schools of thought that believe World War I is the most influential war of, obviously of our time, but in world history. And I would have to agree with them. I really do believe it. And really excited for tomorrow's episode, or it might be tomorrow's episode, we'll just say it. Tomorrow's episode about the Marne, because that is the battle that sets the tone for this entire war. And if that battle is the most important battle of World War I, then that kind of makes it the most important battle of the world history. But World War I changes the landscape of the world completely. And it sets up the immediate aftermath, which is World War II. And then even beyond that, it sets up our modern history. It changes how we view warfare. It changes how we view world powers. And it changes a lot of stuff about how we, fight wars and think about peace and think about war crimes and think about so many geopolitical factors that we kind of just take for granted nowadays we didn't really have before World War I. Even thinking about the US as a real world power and a military power doesn't really happen until after World War I and World War II. That's when the US really kind of comes into its, into its power as a big world player. So, sources for the episode are theworldwar.org, history.com, britannica.com, wikipedia.com, and euratlas.net. And I guess I should probably mention, in some of the later episodes, I'll be using like a personal source, because I had a grandfather that fought in World War I. He's a great-grandfather. And he actually, he joined up before the U.S. actually entered the war, because he joined up with Canada. And so I have some of his personal accounts, some of his journals, letters that he wrote from the Western Front that that I'll be able to pull from in some of the later episodes. Because he didn't join up until 1916, so I don't have any of his accounts before that. But I think that'll be a really cool detail to add. Wasn't really anybody special, just kind of another soldier in the war, but I think that's also really important to see that perspective in that war, just kind of one of those regular guys. So we're going to go all the way to the beginning. I told you I was going to talk from the build-up to the aftermath. And today is the build-up. So we're going to go back to about 1900, and Europe looked vastly different from what it is today. Almost all of the countries at the time are empires or kingdoms. A big exception being France, which is a republic and has no monarch or emperor. So if the UK is a constitutional monarchy, the Ottoman Empire is turning into a constitutional monarchy at this time, but there's no monarch or emperor for France. There's just presidents over there. So it's not necessarily an important detail, but it is interesting because in the aftermath of World War I, and especially after World War II, the political landscape changes drastically across Europe as monarchies go away in favor of republics and democracy. Excuse me. Oh man, we're yawning like crazy tonight. Republics, democracy, socialist and even communist governments. Because and then at least two cases in Italy and Germany after World War I, we see fascism come to rise. But that's for later. So right now would be a great time to pull out your map if you have one. But you can also check out that source that I talked about last, euratlas.net. Will give you some really good maps from the 20th century Europe. And this is important because the geopolitical layout of Europe matters for the buildup of World War I a lot. Countries that hold basically the same boundaries today, though, are like the UK. Basically the same because they lose most of the territory in Ireland around this time. Within the next couple decades, Ireland's going to win their independence. France holds basically the same boundaries, Spain and Portugal, and Italy. But in the year 1900, Germany is an empire, and it stretches across the upper region of Europe from the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands to what in modern times is Lithuania, but back in 1900s was Russia. So the whole modern country of Poland is also within the borders of 1900 Germany. I guess maybe not the entire country, but a large portion of it, because there's also Russian Poland. Austria-Hungary covers a lot of Middle Europe, and it borders Germany, Russia, and the Balkan states, and has a very strong alliance with Germany, specifically in the case of Russian aggression. The Balkan states, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Romania and Bulgaria to the east, their borders aren't quite what they are today. Serbia is a little bit bigger. Romania, I'd say, is probably smaller than what it is today. The Ottoman Empire stretches over the southern part of Europe, just above Greece. It covers Turkey and most of the northern Middle East up to the borders of Iran. So that's like Iraq, Jordan, Israel, all those countries up in the northern Middle East. Countries like Azerbaijan, pretty sure, yeah, okay. Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, those countries are all part of Russia at this time. So like the Ukraine, borders just aren't there. So a lot of those countries in Europe don't exist right now. The big boys in charge right now are, and I'm just going to go down the list. So some of these rulers or heads of state, that's the term I'm looking for, aren't necessarily in charge in the year 1900, but they are the ones that cover World War I, and especially are the big decision makers in this buildup. So big boys in charge, the presidents of France. The really important one is Raymond Poincaré. I'm going to butcher his name. I'm just going to say it how it's spelled. Raymond Poincaré, who was in office for the 7 years before, during, and after World War I. Germany is Kaiser Wilhelm. Russia is Tsar Nicholas II. The UK, Queen Victoria is followed by Edward VII for about 9 years, and then King George V, who reigns during the World War I period. So, excuse me again. The British prime ministers during World War I were Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George. So Asquith and George, right about 1916, they changed power. Austria-Hungary, the emperor is Franz Joseph, and his heir is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In Italy, King Victor Emmanuel III is ruling. The Ottoman Empire is Mehmed V, who around this time attempts to rule as a constitutional monarch, handing power over to a party called the Young Turks. In Serbia, we have King Peter I, and Bosnia, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, is occupied and later annexed by Austria-Hungary. So we'll get into it in a minute. Control over Bosnia changes hands. The U.S. presidents from 1900 to the end of World War I were first Roosevelt, and that's Teddy Roosevelt, obviously, Taft, and Wilson. And Wilson is the one who presides over the U.S., specifically during the war. And that's where we sit, with the who's who of European and U.S. rulers. The U.S. rulers don't do that much until late in the war, but their decisions up until that point still have an impact. Especially, just declaring us neutral during that period. So, at the turn of the century, Russia is still a really big power player, partly because they're so big, and also they have a long legacy of not being super friendly with the rest of Europe. They do have some European allies. But the UK, France, Spain, basically all the other European powers are looking to expand empires and take over the world. Like, maybe not all of them feel that way, but both the UK and France have a lot of territories in other parts of the world, especially Africa and the Middle East. Russia's looking to expand on its eastern borders into China and Korea. And right now, the UK is occupying Egypt and India. And that's an important detail that will come into play later. Russia is feeling a lot of tension both internally and externally on both its European and its Asian borders. So if you caught the second episode of Bitchin' Betty, we covered the two major battles of the Russo-Japanese War, which took place from 1904 to 1905, and significantly strengthened Japan at Russia's expense. And this kind of just tightens the noose around Tsar Nicholas just a decade before Russia enters World War I. And that's kind of where Russia is sitting. And I guess the really big, the spark to this powder keg is in the Balkan region, where there has been unrest for years, mainly directed at the Ottomans and Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary right now is formally overseeing Bosnia, which is officially a territory of the Ottoman Empire. But in 1908, when the Young Turks seized political power of the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary uses this opportunity of unrest to assert themselves over the Balkans. Bosnia declares themselves an independent nation. And they had done this before, but it wasn't really recognized. And what's different now is that the independence is recognized, although obviously not by Austria-Hungary. And this angers Serbia, because some of the Balkan states are friends right now. And they're looking to kind of form this kingdom called Yugoslavia, which comes into play later after World War I. But they're really upset about this because they don't want to be ruled separately by other powers that aren't Slavic. So Bosnia declaring independence, Austria-Hungary ignoring this independence and annexing Bosnia angers Serbia. It gives rise to a pro-Slavic sentiment throughout the region. And it also upsets the allies of the Balkan provinces like Russia, although Russia can't do much at this point because they are fresh off the Russo-Japanese loss. What they do start, however, is encouraging a Serbian nationalist movement with pro-Russia and anti-Austrian sentiment. And this escalates tensions. It puts everybody in Europe on edge. Because Serbia and Austria-Hungary have opposing allies. A series of short but important conflicts take place in 1912 and 1913 called the Balkan Wars. And it doesn't pull the rest of Europe into it yet, but it results in stronger and empowered Balkan states, and it weakens the Ottoman hold in Europe. So if you're seeing some modern day similarities, good, because you should be. Because that's what's worked for thousands of years to accomplish political ends, and it's still working today. Governments are just using more avenues to do it. I mean, that really just stood out to me. I'm thinking like, okay, well, you know, governments have definitely, I mean, America especially has put their 2 cents in to states where there's a lot of unrest so that we can get a result that favors alliances with our country, or cooperative heads of state. So, I mean, they're doing it in the early 1900s, and they've been doing it for thousands of years, and they're doing it today. So during this crisis in the Balkans, the Austrian Army Chief of Staff makes a point to get in touch with his German counterpart and gains reassurance that not only will Germany side with Austria-Hungary if things escalate, but they will also wage war with Russia's allies in Europe, specifically France. If you've seen the meme of Kronk from The Emperor's New Groove, this is that moment where he's like, oh yeah, it's all coming together. And I don't know who Yzma would be, but probably Austria. So between Austria-Hungary and the Balkan nations, the stage has been set for World War I. And people are ready. And here is kind of where, I guess maybe it's like a pause, but here's kind of where I think about the massive advancements in technology that have taken place since the last major conflicts of Europe. And kind of, you know, they're on the cusp of even more. And this is just, I mean, you got to think like the ability to move troops. We have cars now. We have trucks. We have planes, like firepower, naval power, air power, all of these things that we didn't really have in an effective sense before World War I. Because some of these things, like machine guns and whatnot, we had these, we had the ideas of these, but we weren't using them in war yet. Especially, like, nowhere near on the scale that we see in World War I. I think the closest thing we get is the Russo-Japanese War, where we see some pretty serious trench warfare, and we see a really decisive naval battle that is kind of the first of its kind with modern ships and modern artillery on these ships. We know today the kind of destruction that took place and the absolutely horrific loss of life that took place over the course of 5 years, but they didn't know. And the world is not even a generation away from the Gatling gun getting a real motor instead of a hand crank. And that's kind of where we are. Like, machine guns are being developed in the decades prior to World War I, but they weren't very efficient. They weren't the standard of war that they are today. And we can probably thank World War I for that, because nothing promotes innovation like widespread war. The Gatling gun was invented in the Civil War because of what Gatling saw during the Civil War. And we see that again. We see a massive influx of weaponry and all that, you know, surrounding the industry of World War I. So as we saw in the Russo-Japanese War, like I said, naval warfare, it's coming off the cusp of real advancement with radio, monocaliber guns, ship builds, etc. A lot of that advancement has come from Europe, especially Britain, who supplied Japan with their ships during the Russo-Japanese War in the first place. And it's actually naval warfare that pulls America into World War I. So on land, trench warfare is really what defines this war. And we'll see in the next episode as we cover the Marne how that comes to be. Trench warfare is not new, but the advancement of firepower combined with low troop mobility necessitates the need for trenches throughout World War I, especially since firepower and artillery and machine guns at this point in time has outpaced the advancement in troop movement. Trucks and aircraft carriers and large planes that can move a lot of troops. We're not there yet. We can't move troops the way that we can destroy other troops. So trench warfare is what we have because of that. And the next episode we'll talk about it more in depth, about like how we set up the trenches, especially during the Marne, and how that kind of predicates everything else that we see happen in World War I. So, back to the timeline. Excuse me, back to yawning. Gosh. In 1914, tension's been building for years. We've had our Balkan Wars. The Serbian nationalist movement has grown, and they have formed a plan to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austria-Hungary throne, on his visit to Bosnia that summer. So in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip shoots both the Archduke and his wife Sophie at point-blank range, killing them instantly. It only takes a month for Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia and for the Allies to join in. So I'm going to go down this timeline for the month of August. So, June 28th, Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. So, a month to the day. August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia and signs an alliance with Turkey, which is under the Ottoman Empire. France prepares in defense of Russia. August 2nd, Germany invades Luxembourg, which is like super tiny little country in between Germany and France, right below Belgium. August 3rd, Germany declares war on France. August 4th, Germany declares war on Belgium. Britain declares war on Germany, and the US declares itself neutral, officially. August 10th, France declares war on Austria-Hungary. August 11th, Montenegro, which is a tiny little Balkan country, declares war on Germany. August 12th, Britain declares war on Austria-Hungary. And August 23rd, the invasions really begin. Germany invades France, and Austria-Hungary invades Russian Poland, and Japan declares war on Germany. So on August 27th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Belgium. So you're kind of seeing how everything interweaves. The Allies who kind of set their sides, the Central Powers who kind of set their lines, and everyone is declaring war on everyone, except for the US, who declares war on no one. So from August 26th to the 30th, the first big battle of World War I takes place. And it is a crushing defeat for the Russians. So what happens is Russia sends troops to East Prussia, which is the easternmost portion of the German Empire, which borders Russia. They do this during the middle of August. The First Army of Russia heads north, while the Second Army goes south, all still within East Prussia. This takes Germany off guard because they had placed the bulk of their force on the western French side. So Russia was moving their troops a lot faster than anticipated, and what Germany had done was put, an overwhelming force on the western front because their plan was to invade France. And so they didn't expect Russia to build up those troops on their eastern border, but that's what happens, and so Germany sends troops to respond. Since the two Russian armies had taken this approach, though, going north and also going south, they wind up separated by the Masurian lakes, and communication between the armies degrades. So this left them unable to effectively coordinate their movements. And this is deadly for them. After intercepting uncoded messages between the two Russian generals, the Germans take them by surprise at Tannenberg. Samsonov, the commander of Russia's Second Army, had been continuously advancing with his troops, and because the Germans knew where he was going, they set up their little surprise attack, and basically they form a U around where they believe Samsonov's army is going to advance, and Samsonov falls right into it. So he winds up surrounded on three sides by German forces. And the other flaw here is that they had also underestimated the German strength. So even though they had taken the Germans by surprise, the Germans respond in kind. And after 3 days of being shelled by artillery, they attempt to retreat, only to be cut off and slaughtered. This destroys the Second Army. Samsonov, this is the first defeat of the war. It's the end of August. They've been at war for, let's look at the timeline again. Germany declares war on Russia. Oh shoot, it's not on my timeline. We'll just continue. They've barely been at war for a couple of weeks officially, and he's already lost. And so on the morning of August 30th, Samsonov walks off into the forest and shoots himself. The death toll for the Russians was somewhere in the ballpark of 50,000 men, with almost 100,000 men taken prisoner. It destroys the Second Army. It leaves Russia crippled at the very beginning of a war they would somehow still lose, even though they were ultimately on the winning side. And that's called the communist surprise, but more on that some other time. The one thing Tannenberg did for the Allies, though, was provide enough of a distraction to the Germans that they pulled a significant number of troops from the Western Front to support the Germans who were already engaging the Russians. So I think the Germans didn't really think it was going to be that quick, because from the first day of that battle to the end, it lasts 4 days. The Germans, I don't think, believed it was going to be that quick, or they were going to completely decimate the Second Army. So they had their initial set of troops go, and then they were sending more behind them. Those troops that they sent behind the first wave didn't make it to Tannenberg for the battle, and they wound up in basically German limbo. They were unable to make it back to the Western Front quickly enough to help their fellow troops in the Battle of the Marne, which begins in early September. And because they weren't there, well, we can only speculate that their extra numbers would have given them a leg up, but these troops aren't there, and the Marne is a major Allied victory. It is the line in the sand where France says, this is the Gandalf moment. This is "you shall not pass," but in France. And that's where we end for this episode. So we'll pick it up again for part 2 tomorrow evening in September of 1914 on the Western Front. So as we are invading France. So thank you for listening, and I hope you tune in for part 2. This has been great. I love these history podcasts because I get to do so much research, and I learn just so much about all of these things, and it's hard, I think, to put it into this 20 to 30 minute snapshot for you to really walk away with, a reasonable amount of knowledge about what happened. So that's kind of why I wanted to do this as a mini series over time. So we'll do the 2 parts every 4 weeks, right about there. Unless you want to hear more often. So If you want to hear it more often, I believe the email is up in our feed. Let us know. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you guys have a great night.